Now, you may know the Prime Minister visited Alice Springs in an effort to help resolve a crisis since the lifting of alcohol bans in the Northern Territory. Restrictions on alcohol purchases were among a number of new measures that were announced by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and First Minister Natasha Fyles to combat surging crime levels in Alice Springs yesterday. Well, takeaway purchases of alcohol will be prohibited on Mondays and Tuesdays and will only be permitted between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. on the remaining days. And each person will have one transaction limit per day. Well, let's get a thought or two from Shane Varcoe. He's the CEO at Dalgarno Institute, one of the 300-plus member organisations of the World Federation Against Drugs. Shane Varcoe, a special welcome back to 2020.
Happy New Year to you, Neil. Good to be back.
Hey, Shane, you've got some connections to Alice Springs. You're not in the Alice, you're in Victoria, but you do have some connections there, and you've got a finger on the pulse of some of the things developing there.
Yeah, Neil, that's true. Our work is Australia-wide, and we have board members from different disciplines, and one of our board members actually lives and works in the Alice, and he's very close ties with Indigenous communities and works closely with them in his role, which I'll keep that private. But he's been watching with some concern about what's happening, but also concern about some of the potential for inappropriate reporting that can damage reputations as well. And I think that's important. And what's happening is very disturbing. There's no doubt about that. And the lifting of alcohol bans is a significant, one of probably the most significant, biggest contributor to this spike in crimes. It's not just obviously acquisitional crimes, but domestic and familial violence, and it's just very, very disturbing. And he's experienced that firsthand as well. But yeah, it is concerning. And again, there's a great deal of issues here that need to be discussed and brought forward.
Let's just pick up on something you just mentioned, and that is around the reporting on what's happening in Alice Springs, because lots of us might be familiar, if you've watched any television news, some of those images of youths roaming the streets and beating each other with iron bars and all sorts of things like that. What's your thought here on not letting the whole community be demonised? Obviously there's a problem, but certainly those sorts of images don't help, do they?
No, and again, we understand with news, and unfortunately what we call news now is often just opinions cycled through with sensationalism for the purposes of clickbait, basically. That's not taking away from some of the atrocities that have been committed, and it is appalling. There's no doubt. But as I said, our colleague working and living in the Alice, that's not prolific everywhere. That is still a concern. I think one of the biggest concerns too is understanding from the data. We've been watching this for a while on our First Peoples component of our No-Brainer website. We've obviously worked, and we have an Indigenous component to our community, our alcohol and other drug curriculum, and we work closely with different people in the Indigenous community to make sure that our understanding of cultural dynamics as best we can, because we understand there are many different nations amongst the Indigenous community, and therefore there's different perspectives in some sense, but there's a general consensus around some of this stuff that's quite clear. And the elders that we've spoken to and got advice from have been quite forthcoming about this. And the concern is, well, one of the things we need to get straight is the alcohol consumption rates per capita and alcoholism and problematic alcohol use is much less in the Indigenous community than it is in the Caucasian or non-Indigenous Australian community. I think that's an important thing to put on the table to start off with. And they often think, alcoholism is rife and it's a real problem. Indigenous people have this major issue. Whilst they have issues with it, their issues are not worse than the non-Indigenous community. I think that's a really important thing to table straight away. But yeah, I think the lifting of bans that took place last year was really concerning. And in fact, Indigenous communities across the Northern Territory came out very quickly and quite ferociously against the move. Even some saying, even if they were perhaps in agreement with the lifting of bans, one such commentator, an Indigenous commentator, said it's like pulling out the Afghan withdrawal, and that's how they put it. It said, okay, we might lift the bans, but don't just pull them all out at once, because we're going to have a real problem. And in fact, that problem manifested quite quickly. And in fact, last year in June, a coalition of Aboriginal Medical Alliance Services and then NT, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, and the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency wrote a letter to the Minister, Lindy Burney, regarding this issue. And they were saying quite that this is not, again, pushing back against this neo-woke, virtue signalling, that, that this is not a racist issue. Having these bans in, this is protective and proactive, and it's positive, and we need to perhaps review it and look at it, but let's not lift this. This is working. This is actually helping our communities, keeping our women safe, our young people safer. And so these are issues that were tabled very quickly, but they were ostensibly ignored by the government, and they went ahead with again. We talk about patriarchy making decisions, sort of white patriarchy making decisions. It seems to be working in that opposite direction at the moment.
This is interesting, isn't it?
A really bad decision. Yeah.
Because the Voice is very prominent in the national discussion, debate leading up to, this opportunity. We'll all have a vote. Interestingly, this brings something to light, and alcohol being at the centre of it, is that no one's listening to the elders. If they're not listening to the elders now, no one will probably listen to the elders then. Challenging thoughts around that, but this just brings to light, doesn't it, that the white patriarchy, in one sense here, not listening to the elders, and the elders, in some sense here, must be considered to know best. Any thoughts here around elders and alcohol, and whether local communities can have some level of control in their own community?
Well, that was the reason for the initial setup of these community bans and dry zones, and the consultation was done quite significantly, as I understand it, previously, and the vast majority of communities in the Northern Territory and other parts of Australia were on board with this. In fact, not every community was, clearly, but as I understand it, the majority were. And this was rolled out over a period of time. Again, the elders came and said, we're concerned about our young people, we're concerned about the rise in familial and domestic violence, and alcohol is the single biggest contributor to it in that context. Sure, it's not the only factor, but once they took the alcohol, or the heavily restricted alcohol use in these communities, much of the incidences, the frequency of these incidences reduced significantly, but also the ferocity. You got to remember, the argument from some people is, alcohol doesn't make people violent, they're already violent. But what alcohol can do, if an individual is violent, is increase quite significantly the intensity and ferocity of that abuse. And so there's a real concern here that we're not just looking at alcohol as a one single layered issue. This is quite multi-layered. And of course it affects physical health, mental health, productivity, motivation, all those sort of things. And of course, criminal activity is a real concern as well, and fueled by alcohol. And so again, these measures that were implemented over a long period of consultation, over a long period of time, the elders were the ones who were saying, we want to protect and develop our communities in healthy and safe ways. And then, of course, you get activists and others that come in underneath that and try and undermine that wisdom, that elderly wisdom. But that we see that across cultures everywhere. If a new fad comes in and the social media voice gets hold of it, then obviously it trumps wisdom and the tradition and clarity and best practice, because it's the newest noise in the marketplace.
Shane,
so I think that's a concern too. Yeah,
it is. The new measures, as you say, the lifting of the bans happened without any incremental lifting, and all of a sudden alcohol was available. So now there's new measures implemented, and a 3-month trial now. They've taken away alcohol for 2 days, restricting sales on Monday and Tuesday, and then only sales between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. on the remaining days, and each person will have 1 transaction limit per day. Obviously, experts have had their minds around trying to, in some ways, gently reinforce these bans. What are your thoughts on whether that's going to make any difference at all?
Well, again, it's the proof's in the pudding, and it's capacity to access this product. Well, this product is the legal drug that does the most harm because it is legal. And we can talk about the cannabis issue. We're going to throw another one in that ring, but we won't go there today. It's another nightmare pending. But I think these measures obviously will deter. But again, it's always about implementation. It's always about enforcement. And if the purveyors of alcohol aren't strictly on board and don't adhere to this strictly, and of course people buy for others, there's all sorts of ways that they try and get around it. That's why dry zones were so powerful. And people would argue, oh, you can go outside the dry zone and get alcohol, but you have to travel quite a way to get it. And then if you're intoxicated usually on your own. So the damage that you do is to yourself. That's sad enough in itself, of course, but you're not harming others around you. But bringing it back into the town and using it in the town was really difficult to do. So we know that those kind of bans, those kind of restrictions do work. Half measures, again, I honestly don't know. We hope that it will have some impact on curtailing these behaviours, these really disturbing community harming behaviours. But and not least for those causing the harm, because they too are going to be in all sorts of trouble from the not just the actions themselves, but the repercussions from that. But I think one of the issues here, we have to see what happens. But it's fascinating when you take a carte blanche lifting of bans, then go, oh, whoops, we've cut the brake line. Now we're trying to reapply the brakes while mending the brake line as we do it. It's one of those. As that Indigenous commentator said, it's like the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was too quick, it was too much, and it was too fast, and it caused all sorts of issues. And now they're trying to do some remedial work, which is, I hope it works, Neil. I hope it does have some impact, but
at least they're doing something, Shane. Hey,
exactly.
When the Prime Minister arrives in a community, like he did into Alice Springs, and we'll all know, in some sense, the Prime Minister doesn't have all the answers, and just the fact that he's there isn't going to solve the problem, but it does draw that media attention. It draws the national consciousness to the issue around alcohol. This can only be a positive from your perspective as a campaigner in this area around drugs and alcohol. So attention of the nation is on alcohol right now. Are there some lessons we ought to be applying ourselves to? Because there's lots of communities around Australia. It's not going to be just the Alice that's having some issues around grappling with alcohol and youths and family violence, those sorts of things. What sort of lessons might there be for communities everywhere looking on at what's happening and the fact that there is now some national attention on the Alice issue?
I think one of the things that's really important here is, as we opened with my opening statement regarding the Indigenous rates of alcohol misuse compared to the non-Indigenous community, I think this needs to be a message for all Australians. I think that's the thing. Every person who inhabits this country, no matter your background, no matter your traditions and your cultural framing of alcohol, we all know now from the science that alcohol, ethanol, is a class 1 carcinogen. It causes damage at all sorts of levels, including cancers. And even now, the Canadians have come out, interestingly enough, even in the last couple of weeks, which is, I find fascinating in the timing of this. The Canadians have come out and they've actually upped the ante on the world alcohol consumption ratios and said there should be no more than 2 standard drinks a week for alcohol use. That's their recommendation they're pushing for in Canada. At the moment, we have, I think it's about 2 standard drinks a day, I think is our recommendation for safer drug use. But of course, the safest consumption of alcohol is none. That's now on the table. If you want to have the best chance for health, best chance for well-being moving forward and to lower the risks of all the health harms from alcohol, then no consumption. The A word, abstinence, is back on the table, and they really grit their teeth when they have to say that. But abstinence is back on the table as best practice for alcohol consumption. And I think it's important that all Australians get on board and not have the attitude, well, I'm not Indigenous, I don't have that problem, that's not my community, I'm okay, Jack. But the problem is every excessive consumption of alcohol that manifests itself in some sort of harm to the community, whether it be drink driving, domestic violence, unruly behaviour in public, all of that, or even in the home, all of that adds to the burden of non-communicable disease in our culture and the harm to our culture. And I think the message should be, as Australians together, what is best practice for all of us and how can we best promote that? And particularly help the communities that are extra struggling, which are not just the Indigenous communities, but some other ethnic minority communities have real difficulty with this as well. And I think we need to be more caring for our neighbour in that context.
The safest position, as you say, is abstinence. That might be a dream for communities everywhere around Australia. It's let's say the word one more time. Abstinence from alcohol is the best position.
I'm swearing at some Australians right
now. and as you say, rightly too, the research shows that it is carcinogenic. And in cases like this, we're seeing it leads to community disintegration. And I'm wondering, and Dalgarno Institute, a fabulous organisation, I wonder if you've got a thought or two for church communities around the nation that might be thinking about their own challenges and problems right now. Do churches, do you think, have a tight enough understanding on the dangers of alcohol? Is there something that churches perhaps need to focus a little more on when it comes to the difficulties in their own communities? Any thoughts here?
Well, I can give some thoughts. Obviously, Dalgarno is not a religious organisation. We're a health education charity, but obviously different traditions and philosophies, and we work with both secular and religious communities. We don't discriminate in that context. And I think when it comes to my experience in the religious communities, their concern for their well-being of their citizens, not just their members, but their communities, is quite high. And there's been, in the last probably 20 years, 15 years, there's been a shift in a lot of Christian religious communities, at least in the Islamic communities and Hindu communities, there hasn't been a shift. But in the Christian religious communities, there's been a shift towards alcohol consumption, more alcohol consumption, I should say, which is a bit concerning. Considering that when you've got a community that's struggling or failing with the alcohol issue, another drug issue, models that give a clear example of a lifestyle that can operate well and function well without the need for consumption of alcohol. So we don't need it. We don't need it. And of course, the argument about for example, the Quran is a prohibition document. Whereas the Bible is not a prohibition document. It doesn't prohibit alcohol, but it's a strongly abstinent-focused book. It has a lot to say about the harms of alcohol. And it doesn't praise alcohol, it doesn't laud it, it doesn't promote it in any way. It permits it, it allows it. And I think that's a recalibration that needs to be looked at in the community churches to say, well, what are we doing as an example? Are we helping our community? Does my consumption of alcohol add to the community benefit or take from it? Well, how can I add value to my community by promoting a lifestyle that's alcohol free? I think that's a really important thing, and a lot more Australians are starting to look at this. And at the moment, between the demographic 16 to 65-year-olds, statistically, 21% of that demographic do not drink at all. They're completely abstinent. So there's 21% of the 14 to 65-year-olds don't drink at all, according to the latest data, and that's increasing. And it's fascinating that a lot of Christian religious communities are stepping into alcohol, where a lot of secular groups are stepping away from it. So I'm fascinated by that transition and wondering what's causing that. But I think from a missional perspective, I think one of the best things you can do is actually present a model, an abstinent behaviour, not a prohibitive one, but an abstinent behaviour that really does point to a healthier way of living.
Good insights, good wisdom, Shane Varcoe, as we always hear from you, whether we're talking alcohol or other issues around drugs. And no doubt we'll get some more opportunities through the year, and looking forward to those already. Shane Varcoe is CEO at Dalgarno Institute. They're one of the member organisations of the World Federation Against Drugs. Good insights into what's happening in Alice Springs today. And let me point listeners to dalgarnoinstitute.org.au and a particular website that is very informative, the No Brainer website, nobrainer.org.au. You can subscribe to that and receive newsletters, and there's also a YouTube channel. Shane Varcoe, thanks so much for your insights today on 2020.
My pleasure, Neil, as always, and thanks for having me.